and I'm pretty excited about welcoming Dr. John Webb. John will discuss the psychological and spiritual nature of forgiveness and how forgiveness relates to health, with a particular focus on addiction recovery. His latest book, Understanding Forgiveness and Addiction, offers a comprehensive look at, at the body of his work and all about forgiveness. So it is really good to welcome you, John. We're really glad that you're part of our workshop process because I think especially, that you have something really valuable to add to our recovery process. And take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. It's an honor to be here. I'm glad that you asked me to give this talk today. So thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to having this discussion. I guess I'll go ahead and share my screen now. So there should be one. Let me see if I can do something here. No, I don't think it's, whoops. Okay, so do you see one slide?
Yes, John, it's perfect.
Okay, great. All right, so thank you again. As you can see, my topic today is going to be all about forgiveness and how it's related to addiction, but I'm also going to talk, and actually I'll do the overview slide in a second, but the picture at the bottom corner is the cover of my book, and here's a picture of it all. I don't see if you can, it's always strange to try and do that because it'll never pick it up, but anyway, so that's my book, and I'm not here to sell it, but I just thought I'd show you the cover and let you know what it looks like. Actually, a thought that just came to my mind, I got to pick that cover, and I think to me I really like it a lot. I like the different colors and the way it blends around and that sort of thing. So that was one of the pluses about getting the book all finalized and everything. But anyway, let me go to the overview page. So I'm going to discuss, as was mentioned, the psychological and spiritual nature of forgiveness. As I would argue that the spiritual nature of forgiveness has been around since day one, so to speak. And so that's what I'll talk about a little bit first. And then I'll be very focused for most of the talk on psychological types of issues related to forgiveness. And so I'll be explaining the theoretical nature of the relationship between forgiveness and health, and then also with a particular focus in the context of addiction recovery. And then I'll spend some time talking about some of the scientific evidence that supports the beneficial association of forgiveness with health. There's theory, there's anecdotal evidence, people saying themselves, yes, this is important, it helps, but it's also very important, and I think also interesting to look at what the science, so to speak, says about forgiveness that confirms really what the anecdotal evidence has been for many, many, many people over since day one, so to speak, I would argue. So those are the kind of things that we'll be talking about. And I believe we're going to save questions until the end, correct? So we should have at least a half hour or so at the end for questions. So whenever I give a talk on forgiveness, and I guess in a way I sort of have to apologize if you've seen that talk that I gave to a group in South Africa, or I think there's a couple other talks on YouTube that I've given, but I always start with these two quotes. I think they're very profound statements, and I think I like to start with them and let them kind of percolate in people's minds as we talk. And that first one there by Martin Luther King Jr. He said, this was actually back in 1964 when he was accepting his Nobel Peace Prize. In his speech, he said, "There is a sort of poverty of the spirit which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. We have learned to fly the air like birds and swim the sea like fish, but we have not learned the simple art of living together as brothers." Now, obviously, the word forgive or any of its variants is not in that statement, but to me, the implication is there that we have not, related to the reality that we have not learned how to live together. Forgiveness, I believe, is something that will help us get there, hopefully. The other quote there by Gandhi back in 1931. So I'll tell you an interesting side thing. I included both of these quotes in my book, and they're quotes that are all over the internet. And I thought, if I put them in my book, I actually need to make sure it's not just the internet. You can't trust everything you read on the internet. So I tracked them down, and these are actual quotes by these gentlemen. The one by Gandhi was way back in 1931. "What is true of individuals is true of nations. One cannot forgive too much. The weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong." And I think, again, it's a very powerful statement. Oftentimes in our society and culture, the implication is, as Gandhi said almost 100 years ago, forgiveness is kind of a weak thing if you do it because you're weak, or, you can't kind of do what you really want to do or something. But I think it really is true that it takes strength to do it. And I think some of that will probably come out as we talk about different definitions and aspects of the process of forgiving. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about some of the spiritual things first, and then focus heavily on psychological types of ways to approach understanding forgiveness. My first slide here, is it a secular or a spiritual thing, forgiveness? And it's interesting because as a psychological scientist, when I started to become interested in forgiveness when I was in graduate school and in the context of studying it scientifically in the early to mid 90s, it was difficult to publish research in the context of forgiveness. People were working on it. Ev Worthington and Robert Enright, still the two big people in the world that are known for the psychology of forgiveness. They were doing their work then, but much of the work was published in religious or spiritually oriented journals, scientific journals, but purposely focused on religious issues, the psychology of religion. That's where most of the work was being published. That's where it was acceptable to be considered in scientific arenas. Now, over the years, it's interesting because kind of a new development, so to speak, called positive psychology, which focuses on human strengths and virtues. How do we improve those? How do people access those qualities that they have, rather than simply focusing on things like depression or anxiety, and the problems that those are for people? How do we encourage the strengths and virtues that human beings already have? And so forgiveness became a component in the positive psychology movement. So now, strangely, it's kind of considered a secular thing first. When I try and publish things, it's not uncommon for reviewers to come back and say, when I make statements assuming that there's a spiritual nature to it, reviewers will come back and say, well, you need to explain that. This is a psychological thing. So it's really kind of an interesting turn of events. So it is both. Clearly, there's a long-standing spiritual, religious connection with the construct of forgiveness, and psychology and other aspects of social science have taken hold of it as well. So it is both. One of the things that I like to do in talking about spirituality is talk about a model of spirituality that with colleagues I have been working on and developing over the years. And it's kind of weird how this sort of acronym name came about, but we call it the right model of spirituality, RITE. Ritualistic spirituality, theistic spirituality, and existential spirituality. So we think about spirituality in the context of it being multidimensional. For a long time, people focused kind of on religiousness. Relatively recently in scientific fields, the idea of spirituality, so to speak, as different from religiousness has come about. But it occurred to me in trying to think about, because if you look at the scientific literature, there's many definitions of spirituality. And so there's a little bit of a difficulty trying to pin it down. And over time, I had thought a lot about this with colleagues, and it seemed like, maybe these two aspects, maybe there's more to it. Maybe it's not just a religious or theistically oriented thing, that spirituality in reality can apply to all people. Atheists can be spiritual, obviously. And so that's kind of what the existential component of it is a non-theistic search for meaning and purpose. Now, they all sort of overlap, at the very least, in terms of we argue that balanced or healthy spirituality is that balanced between the three dimensions, at the very least, respecting the other dimensions. When somebody gets too far in one of the corners and doesn't respect the others, that can lead to problems, actually. So anyway, the way we define spirituality, the salient, searching pursuit of the transcendently sacred, ritualistic, theistic, and or existential aspects of the human condition. And interestingly, I think personally, spirituality is a fascinating thing to me, and I consider myself very fortunate to be able to be paid in my job to do this kind of research, these areas that are just endlessly fascinating to me. And all of that to briefly take a little bit of a side note, but I think it's related. I have another book under contract. It's an edited book looking at, it's titled right now, The Handbook of Spirituality, Health, and Well-Being. And so it's a very broad approach to looking at spirituality related health. We have chapters focused on addiction, but that's only a very small part, so to speak, whereas my forgiveness book is all about addiction recovery. But anyway, one of the chapters in this new book is titled Spirituality or Personality and Spirituality. And there's been a lot of research done, particularly by a person by the name of Ralph Piedmont. I don't know if anybody's interested in or is aware of him or not, but he's done a lot of spirituality, personality related research. And he argues, based on the data, that there is, well, let me step back a little bit. If you're familiar with psychology of personality, you may be familiar with the so-called Big Five personality traits. Has anybody, I guess I only see five other people on my screen. So I guess, maybe we can come back to this later. But if you've heard of that theory of personality, part of why it is so popular in psychology and social science is because research has shown that these big five personality traits, which I'll list off in a second, part of why the research and the theory is so popular is because this the so-called big five traits of personality have been found all across the globe. All human beings everywhere have these basic traits of personality. So it's not restricted to Western thinking or philosophy or anything like that. So it's different than a lot of the other personality theories historically that psychology, Western psychology, so to speak, is known for. So the big five personality traits, the acronym is OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism or emotional stability or instability. And so the data shows that every human being everywhere has these traits to one degree or another. And so going back to Piedmont, his research is showing that maybe spirituality is a sixth personality trait. So maybe it really should be called the Big Six personality theory. And so it's by saying that spirituality might be another common personality trait across the globe, the argument is not that all human beings believe in God. The argument is that all human beings, there's this transcendent kind of component to human nature that we're seeking meaning and purpose outside of ourselves in that kind of spiritual way. And so again, these three components of spirituality, these three dimensions of spirituality that we've focused on in this right model: ritualistic, a structured connection with deity; theistic, a non-structured connection with deity; and existential, a non-theistic search, but still transcendent search for meaning and purpose. And so my argument ultimately is that forgiveness applies to all human beings as a spiritual principle, but also psychologically, as we'll talk about. But by saying it applies to everybody as a spiritual principle does not mean that you have to believe in God or have any particular kind of belief in God or deity, but that it can fit and work in many different belief systems. I do want to go back to scripture just very briefly. I think it's interesting that forgiveness, sometimes people might say, well, that's really just kind of a Christian thing. It's kind of classically associated with Christianity, with the New Testament, as you can see there, the scripture in Matthew about how often Jesus said that people should forgive, basically always. And then also tying it into the Old Testament, thou shalt not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people. And so it's easy to see that forgiveness is, as commonly thought, a fundamental Christian kind of value. But I think it's also interesting to look at other scripture from other mainstream world religions, whether monotheistic like Judeo-Christian beliefs, Islamic beliefs, monotheistic, or whether monotheistic or polytheistic, and we'll get to some Eastern scripture in a second. But from the Quran, what is with Allah is better and more lasting for those who believe and rely on their Lord. And whenever they are angry, they forgive. And the recompense of evil is punishment like it, but whoever forgives and amends, he shall have his award from Allah. And whoever is patient and forgiving, these most surely are actions due to courage. Hindu scripture: knowledge of the field and its knower is true knowledge. Those who know truly are free from pride and deceit. They are gentle, forgiving, upright, and pure, filled with inner strength and self-controlled. I have revealed to you the nature of the field and the meaning and object of true knowledge. Those who are devoted to me, knowing these things, are united with me. And then also Buddhist scripture, he insulted me, he struck me, he cheated me, he robbed me. Those caught in resentful thoughts never find peace. Those who give up resentful thoughts surely find peace. For hatred does not cease by hatred at any time. Hatred ceases by love. This is an unalterable law. So I think reading scripture from different faith traditions about forgiveness makes it all the more, I think, powerful. Forgiveness truly is a spiritual principle shared by all mainstream world religion, regardless of where you go in the world. Okay, so let's switch over to psychology, more specifically right now. As you can see there is something that is termed unforgiveness, and that is defined as a constellation of negative emotions in response to offensive experiences, including hatred, anger, hostility, resentment, bitterness, and fear. And the argument also is that when we're offended and we're experiencing unforgiveness, forgiveness sounds like it's the opposite. But the argument is it's not necessarily a pure opposite, but also because in the data, there's shared variance between forgiveness and unforgiveness, but not totally. So they are different things, not just the opposite of each other. And in that regard, it's argued that forgiveness is one option that we have in response to being offended or experiencing unforgiveness. Others could be justice or denial or revenge. Forgiveness is one thing. It's a choice that we have in response to being offended. It's not a requirement, it's a choice. It's an emotional process, it's a decision, and it's multidimensional. So there's different dimensions of forgiveness in the sense of oftentimes and historically in the last 30-ish years, when we say, I'm interested in the psychology of forgiveness, it kind of meant, you were looking at forgiveness of others. But in the last several years, it's become a lot more common to see a lot of self-forgiveness, forgiveness of self work being done. So that's another dimension of forgiveness, obviously. But there's also other dimensions like forgiving God or conceptions of deity, forgiving uncontrollable situations, so like maybe natural disaster, seeking forgiveness, whether from others or from God, etc., is another dimensional component. Feeling forgiven. So there's many dimensions of forgiveness. One of the things that has happened, unfortunately, is that, as I mentioned, kind of the default area of study for many years was forgiveness of others. And so in a way, that's sort of the default definition of forgiveness that you'll see often when you're reading scientific literature. But as I've said, there are multiple dimensions, and it might be okay generally to sort of use that default definition of forgiveness of others to sort of apply to all of them. And that's kind of what I have in this first dimension or first definition, the general idea of forgiveness. But there are nuanced differences depending on which dimension you're talking about. And then also in the context of forgiving yourself, there's more than nuanced differences, really, because of the fact that you are doing these things in the context of you yourself. So you have done something that you are forgiving yourself for. And so that has different implications, including you cannot avoid yourself, and you have to reconcile with yourself. Forgiveness of others in a very meaningful way than forgiving them. Oftentimes when we forgive others, reconciliation is something that we may or may not be interested in, and it's not required, but oftentimes they kind of go together, but again, they're separate. But when you're thinking about forgiving yourself, you have to reconcile yourself because you have to live with yourself. And so it's a little bit different. There's some of those, there's some nuances that there has to be really kind of a formal different definition for self-forgiveness. But again, they are related. So let me read the first one there. Forgiveness occurs over time. And so this applies to all dimensions, including forgiving others. Forgiveness occurs over time and is a deliberate, volitional process involving a fundamental shift in affect, feelings, emotions, cognitions, thoughts, and or behavior in response to negative feelings regarding an acknowledged offensive experience without condoning, excusing, or denying the transgression. At a minimum, an absence of ill will toward an offender. So as you can see there, that's like, even though we're speaking in English, it's kind of not in English. It's, a very sort of scientific, phrasing of this construct. But I think it's trying to pull out important components. And I'll just touch on a couple here. Fundamental shift in affect, cognitions, and behaviors. So when we're choosing to forgive, there are those affective, cognitive, and behavioral components. We can sort of behaviorally forgive somebody, but that doesn't mean we feel it. There can be a difference. And so ultimately, forgiveness is involving all three of these things. And it's really an internal process in the context, especially when we're thinking about forgiving others, in the context of our relationship with somebody else. It's what's going on for ourselves. We're letting go of all these negative experiences in the context of having been offended. Not to say that it doesn't matter anymore, that it should be a good thing. Our relationship should be exactly the same with the other person. But it's this internal response that we're letting go of these things. And again, in the context of forgiveness of others, it's different, and it's critical to realize that forgiving others does not mean we have to reconcile with them. Oftentimes we want to or get to that place, but we don't have to, certainly not immediately and potentially ever. But self-forgiveness occurs in response to one's own negative feelings in the context of a personally acknowledged, self-instigated wrong that results in ready accountability for said wrong and a fundamental constructive shift in one's relationship to, reconciliation with, and acceptance of the self through human connectedness and commitment to change. So part of that, if, thinking about that closely, part of this definition is in the context of oftentimes people will critique, I've forgiven myself, or I'm thinking about it, or whatever, and people will critique that and say, well, you're just letting yourself off the hook, or it's kind of this narcissistic escape kind of a thing. And that's why these components, personally acknowledged, I'm admitting that I instigated whatever this wrong was. I'm not trying to get off the hook. I'm willing to be accountable, and, you know, reconciling with myself, accepting myself, and still being connected to others. It reminds me of, this is a little bit different, but it brings another dimension of forgiveness into the picture, and that is seeking forgiveness from others. And so several years ago, there was an article published in a newspaper, and I can't remember which one it is right now. But it was basically a story of a man who was seeking 12-step based recovery. I think he was in his 40s or something like that. And part of his story was that in college, he date raped somebody. And so as part of his personal recovery process, he was trying to make amends with this person. And so he contacted the person and acknowledged what happened, and was seeking forgiveness. But arguably, I assume, I don't know, but I assume he was probably trying to find forgiveness for himself too, for what he had done. But part of that process was he had to be accountable for what he did. And so he pursued this person. He didn't say, you know, this happened, please forgive me, but don't do anything to me. He allowed himself, so to speak, to be held accountable, and law enforcement got involved, and I believe he was sent to prison. But that's for a period of time. And the person that he raped forgave him, but he still was held accountable. So that's all, and was willing to be held accountable, so to speak. So this self-forgiveness is not acknowledging something, but please don't do anything to me. This is what happened. I'm acknowledging it. I would like to be forgiven, but whatever needs to happen, needs to happen. And so I thought that was a very powerful story. Okay, so let's talk about defining health. Health is a state, and this is the definition of health from the World Health Organization. And it's actually, I believe, the first principle of their constitution that they developed back in the 1940s. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And so part of why I always include that is that it's important to realize that health and well-being can include many things, not just, as the definition says, an absence of disease or infirmity. And I think part of how that fits in with addiction recovery is sometimes we get focused on, you know, quantities and frequencies and abstinence, perhaps. And I'm not arguing against abstinence at all. I'm just saying that there's many potential indicators of improvement in health, not just zero numbers, whether it's disease, symptoms, or whatever. It's reducing things, ultimately, hopefully getting to zero. Forgiveness and health has been receiving a fair amount of attention for the last 20 to 30 years, and most of the research is showing good, beneficial relationships. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But what I want to talk about in the context of forgiveness and health, before we get to forgiveness and addiction recovery being a manifestation of health, generally, the relationship between forgiveness and health is thought to be there's thought to be a direct relationship, and then also an indirect relationship through other variables, distinct other variables. And so that direct relationship, forgiveness is argued to affect health-related outcomes directly, but it's kind of actually still indirect through an intertwined relationship with stress. And so the more forgiving we are, the less stress we're going to experience in our life in general. And stress is very much related to health. More stress, worse health outcomes. Less stress, our health gets better. And the reason why we kind of don't talk about it as an indirect relationship is because it's kind of, at least in theory, a very intertwined relationship between forgiveness and stress. Whereas there are very sort of distinct relationships through other variables that in turn relate to better health. So forgiveness is thought to operate through better health behavior, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a second, but also better social support. So the more forgiving we are, the more social support we will experience, which is related to better health. There's a very strong relationship between social support and health. And actually, in the context of addiction recovery, that can be seen in the context of kind of having a recovery community, having a support system is critical to better outcomes in addiction. Interpersonal functioning, the more forgiving we are, leads us to have better interpersonal relationships, get along better with other people. And again, that is strongly tied to health. Now, the idea with health behavior, I want to focus on that for a second. And this kind of ties into the stress thing as well. But when we're unforgiving, a lot of that is ruminating and becoming consumed by the offense and the negative emotions and the hard feelings and et cetera. We're very focused on that when we're unforgiving. And so that can lead to poorer health. But the other side of it is, if we can forgive, it sort of frees up that energy that we're using being consumed by all of the negative experiences. And so if we're forgiving, frees up that energy, we can use that to engage in healthy behavior, like exercising or better nutrition or those kinds of healthy behaviors, eating better, paying attention deliberately to stress and trying to manage it in a better way. So that's the kind of the general, very basic relationship between forgiveness and health. And there are a lot of studies. This is a review chapter that we wrote, published in the Handbook of Forgiveness, second edition, back in 2020. And by the way, I'm happy to share these slides with people and actual references. Just let me know and I'll be happy to share those. And but if you can see this, it's probably pretty small on your screen, but forgiveness is related to many aspects of health. Similarly with mental health, this is kind of an interesting slide. I won't spend a lot of time with it, but sort of the bottom line of this slide is the very first published studies in the context of forgiveness and mental health were way back in 1947. But it took about 64 years to get about 330 plus studies published. And then in the next, so 64 years to get 334 studies published. Then in the next 6 years, 380 studies were published. And so there's been a boom in researching how forgiveness is related to mental health. And it's related in many different ways, almost whatever, not quite, but almost sort of any variable you look at, there's going to be a constructive relationship. And there are actually there are examples where it can be problematic, but for the most part, forgiveness is very beneficial to mental health, whether forgiveness of others or forgiving ourselves. And an interesting, so, one of the critiques of psychology is that it's very much kind of a Western field. And even in the United States, one of the critiques is, in essence, too much of it is done on a, North American population, United States population. But more and more work is being done in other parts of the world. And one of the interesting things about this forgiveness of others meta-analysis, which is a study of studies that was conducted several years ago, it was conducted in several countries and showing generally that forgiveness of others is associated with well-being, across many countries. So forgiveness and addiction recovery. I put this slide in about defining addiction because I think it's interesting to think about how we define addiction. And so this particular definition, the first one that I'm going to read, was from a handbook put out by the American Psychological Association, handbook on the addiction syndrome. And so this is sort of a gold standard in the context of at least the American Psychological Association. And so the definition here, the essence of addiction, an experiential relationship. That is, experience is the currency of addiction. When a particular pattern of behavior reliably and robustly changes emotional experience, the potential for addiction emerges. Addiction is the description of a relationship between organisms and objects within their environment. And so as you can see here, obviously there's diagnostic criteria for diagnosing alcohol use disorder or cannabis use disorder or whatever, put out by the ICD system, the DSM system. This definition doesn't have any of that in it. It's focusing on the relationship that a person has with a behavior, whether it's substances or the process addictions. Addiction is the description of a relationship between organisms and objects within their environment. And this other related definition, the relationship of addiction, the individual's inability to curtail the activity despite the negative consequences, is what stands as the hallmark of the addiction process. Again, the difficulty of stopping an activity despite all of the negative nonsense that goes on. Okay, so forgiveness and addiction recovery. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step model, has talked about forgiveness. And this is one of the things that I write about in my book and other articles that I've published, that, the 12-step model basically has been talking about forgiveness and its relationship, resentments, the relationship to addiction and recovery since the 1930s. But it's really only been until quite recently that the scientific method has been applied to that anecdotal evidence. Not that it didn't work and we didn't know it and et cetera, and now we're just figuring out, well, hey, maybe it does work. Anecdotally, we've known for a long time that forgiveness is important. And for various reasons, the science has taken a while to pay attention to it. And we're still very much in the early stages. But obviously, I'm here today to talk about what we do know about it, and that it is, the data is showing that there is a very important relationship here. So here's another quote that I like to talk about. And Charles Darwin said this, and I did, Actually, I tracked this down too, so it is real. This is a picture I got off of the internet, but it is real. I think it's in his book, The Origin of Species. He says an American monkey, I don't think he meant to say only American monkeys, but so monkeys, after getting drunk on brandy, would never touch it again, and thus is much wiser than most people. Now, if you're familiar with psychological science and other, medical science, obviously, animals can be taught to drink and use drugs and so on. But I think the argument here is, in a natural environment, a monkey would get drunk once and would not touch it again. So part of what's behind it is expectancies and motivation. And arguably, I think the vast majority of human beings, the first time they taste alcohol, it's an aversive experience. So you have to be motivated to overcome that. And so there's reasons why people drink. And there are arguably also reasons why it's difficult to get into recovery and why addiction occurs. And I think forgiveness can play a big role in addressing some of those reasons why addiction is very difficult. Another quote that I like to share, I don't know if any of you are fans of the American band Alice in Chains or are familiar with Lane Staley, the lead singer, former lead singer. He died from heroin overdose in the early 2000s, I believe. But Lane Staley said in an interview with the magazine Rolling Stone, at the end of the day or at the end of the party, when everyone goes home, you're stuck with yourself. And to me, this quote, it means a lot to me. I resonate with it a lot in the context of addiction, self-forgiveness, those types of issues, struggling in addiction. We have to, and some of the data suggests that to the extent that forgiveness is related to addiction recovery, different dimensions, forgiveness of others, forgiveness of self, forgiving God, feeling forgiven by God, different dimensions. But that looks like the data is showing that unless we can ultimately forgive ourselves, in the context of forgiveness being relevant, not that forgiveness is the only answer, but in the context of when forgiveness is relevant, unless we can forgive ourselves, we may not be able to attain full recovery, full and lasting recovery. So here is the model that I've developed again with colleagues, looking at how forgiveness is likely to be related to addiction recovery. It builds off of Worthington's model that I talked about a little while ago. And all of this, I talked about unforgiveness a little bit and what it meant, kind of a constellation of negative emotions, anger, hostility, resentment in the context of having been offended. And so I'm not sure how well you can see this, but I have kind of faded language above and below kind of the box that says condemnation and unforgiveness. So all of these issues about how forgiveness is related to addictive behavior is when a person is in the context of unforgiveness and condemning themselves, condemning other people. And so forgiveness, we argue, is ultimately related to addictive behavior, and I include in there suicidal behavior. There are scholars out there that identify suicidal behavior as consistent with addictive behavior, and I think that's fascinating literature. Obviously, there's differences, but the argument is that there are some similar components to the processes being experienced by people struggling with addiction and addictive and suicidal behavior. And one little side note, you may or may not be aware, but there is a application, I guess, of the 12-step model, just like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, there's a Suicide Anonymous fellowship as well, based out of Memphis, Tennessee, I believe. But anyway, so similar to Worthington's model of forgiveness operating through health, behavior, social support, interpersonal functioning, which we've termed in this model biopsychosocial functioning, we've added two additional categories of mediators. One we call existangst, and another recovery capital, which you're probably familiar with. All of the things are in our environment that can contribute to recovery. But I want to focus on existangst a little bit. Before I do that, though, first, the direct effect, kind of like before, the direct effect with forgiveness and health in general, very intertwined with stress. In our model of the relationship between forgiveness and addiction recovery, the direct effect is this kind of forgiveness, resentment, intertwined reality, that forgiveness and resentment are so closely intertwined and related to each other that the direct effect is when forgiveness is kind of relieving the resentment problem. One of the quotes from the big book, resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics or people struggling with addiction than anything else. And so that's kind of the direct effect. The indirect effect through existangst, we kind of coined this term. It has to do with existential and teleological angst, emotionally and philosophically driven psychological distress, emotionally struggling with affirming our meaningful existence. I think there's potentially a different dimension to psychological stress, whether it's depression, anxiety, et cetera, when it brings on an existential kind of philosophical component to that depression, or other negative emotions, questioning our meaningful existence. I think that's kind of what we're getting at as a mediating variable, that forgiveness will help address that existangst type of issue, which in turn will help lead to better addiction-related outcomes. And a classic example of this idea of existangst that we've coined is the construct known by the term psychache. And what that is, as you can see there, is the hurt, anguish, soreness, aching, psychological pain in the psyche, the mind, the pain of excessively felt shame, guilt, humiliation, loneliness, fear, angst, and dread. And this is a term coined by a man by the name of Edwin Schneidman. He's considered the father of modern suicidology. And so he argues that this idea of psychache is what is behind suicide ultimately. And I think, in my view, this is a classic example of what we think about in terms of existangst. And I think these kinds of ideas are related to addiction as well, not just specifically suicide. A lot of self-criticism, self-examination, lack of self-worth in the struggle of addiction and recovery. And so another way of talking about psychache is this phrase, an aching soul. And so this is the idea of psychache that we're getting at as one of the mediators that forgiveness operates through by helping with psychache, which in turn will help with better addiction recovery outcomes. So in my book, Understanding Forgiveness and Addiction, the little picture on that first slide, one of the things that I did was provide an overview of all the research that's been done in the context of forgiveness and addiction, whether substances, behavioral addictions, or suicidal behavior. And at that time, this literature review went through probably the end of 2020. So it's been 2.5, almost 3 years now. So there's probably, in the specific context of explicitly, deliberately looking at forgiveness in the context of addiction, there's probably maybe 10, 15 more studies in the context of substances and behaviors, maybe another 10 or so, I would suspect, in the context of suicidal behavior. But through 2020, about 51 studies had been done in the context of forgiveness and substances. And again, these are studies that were deliberately designed to look at these relationships, not sort of data that was collected in passing of some other focused study. So 44 out of those 51, over 86%, showed a beneficial relationship. There was 9 out of the 51 that showed a deleterious association. But by far, the vast majority of those studies showed that forgiveness was associated with better addiction-related outcomes. And also valuable is that these studies were conducted, some of them in the context of clinical settings, some in the context of college students. And as I'm sure you know, college is, oftentimes our field gets criticized for, well, you're just studying college students, by convenience, because that's what you have at your university. And that's a legitimate criticism. But in this case, college students are known for substance problems. And so it's not just a sample of convenience. It's an important population to understand and figure out how we can help addiction recovery in this context. So some of the studies were in clinical, some in college students, and then also community-based participants. As you can see there as well, with suicidal behavior, 100% of the studies showed a beneficial effect, and in various settings. Now, as you can see there, primary care settings, for example, 4 studies, that's not a lot. 36 studies in the context of suicidal behavior is not a lot. 51 is not a lot, especially, if you have any familiarity with psychological research, there's, like self-esteem probably has thousands upon thousands of studies. So we're still very early, but the data is strongly suggesting that this is promising, that forgiveness is very likely related to better outcomes. Enright, as I mentioned briefly before, and Worthington are the 2 people that are really spearheading in the world the psychology of forgiveness. Both have developed their own models of forgiveness interventions. They're very much related to each other, which is not surprising to me, because we're talking about one thing, so to speak, forgiveness, and they're understanding it in a very similar way, which makes sense. Science is about replication, so there's going to be a lot of similarity. There should be a lot of similarity, and so that's one bit of evidence for validity, is that they are similar. Talk about similar processes for developing forgiveness. I want to wrap up in the next minute or so we can have some time, and I'll this and maybe one more slide. But so one of the conclusions. So we go back to that quote from actually the big book, Resentment is the Number One Offender. This other quote from Lane Staley: at the end of the day, or at the end of the party, when everyone goes home, you're stuck with yourself. And so this quote that is in one of my papers. So multiple dimensions of forgiveness have been measured and have been found to be related to addiction recovery, but consistent with over 75 years of unflagging, albeit anecdotal, advocacy it seems likely that self-forgiveness remains the most critical dimension of forgiveness in relation to addiction and recovery. And so the data is showing, again, many dimensions. Data shows that they're related, but ultimately it looks like self-forgiveness is related more frequently. And that combined with self-forgiveness appears to be the lowest when people are, say, coming into treatment. If you measure multiple dimensions of forgiveness, self-forgiveness is the lowest for a person, and it rises through treatment. But the fact that it's the lowest and yet also the most frequently observed, we argue perhaps it is the most important ultimately to recovery in the context of when forgiveness is relevant. We are certainly not making the statement that forgiveness is the one and only solution. We're making the argument that when it's relevant, it's very powerful. And I would also say part of the argument is it's likely to be relevant, but I just want to be clear that we're not saying it's a panacea. Okay, so we're back. This is my last slide. We're back to those two quotes from Martin Luther King and Gandhi, and I want to add a third one. That last one, Mark Twain, a famous American author from, I guess, the mid-1800s, and his real name actually is Samuel Clemens. Forgiveness is the fragrance the violent sheds. I'm sorry, violent. That's a Freudian slip, I guess. Forgiveness is the fragrance the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it. And I think, again, it's a choice. Forgiveness is a choice. Going back to those models of forgiveness intervention by Worthington and Enright, Worthington talks about it being an altruistic gift, especially when we're forgiving others. You know, the person does not deserve it, but we choose to give it in an altruistic sense.